Research that resonates.
Schweizer has not been wrong on any of his years and years of reporting on the Bidens.
Investigations that matter.
If your last name wasn't Biden, do you think you would have been asked to be on the board of 𝑏𝒂?
I don't know. Probably not. But that's, I don't think that there's a lot of things that would have happened in my life that if my last name wasn't Biden.
The only entities, the only people that would report on this, and Peter Schweizer, who deserves a Medal of Freedom, in my view.
This is The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer.
Hello and welcome to a very special edition of The Drill Down. This is 𝐃𝐫𝐤𝐥𝐥. I will be joined by and with Peter Schweizer shortly because I want to introduce what this episode is going to be. Peter and I had the privilege and honor of filling in for Sean Hannity on his national radio show earlier last week. And what this episode will be is actually a combination of two of the interviews we did during that show. One interview is with somebody who's been on the podcast previously, and we're both big fans of his work, author Gerald Posner. As Peter and I reflected on the last year, and it's been a big year in a lot of different ways, we thought, well, wait, what's one of the maybe biggest stories of the year that maybe not enough people are paying attention to? And we're like, let's think about that. And then we're like, oh, wait, remember when that dude took a shot at the president? That was a really big deal. And we're like, oh, yeah. Hey, what do we know about that guy? And we're like, well, not that much when you think about how we know everything else about the guy that shot the healthcare CEO, but we still know very little about Thomas Crooks. So we talked to Gerald Posner about the nature of conspiracy, the fact that little information has been released about him, and what it means for the media ecosystem we exist in 2024 as we look forward to 2025. So that will be the first part of this episode. The next part will be an interview we did with Senator Rand Paul. That's right. For the first time ever, we have an actual U.S. Senator on the podcast. Senator Paul joined us moments after speaking on the Senate floor about the ongoing debate on how to fund the government. But there's a lot of really good stuff in there about some of the examples of waste and abuse of our national budget, the problems we're going to face in 2025, and what he's trying to do to fix it, and why it's important to have real conversations about what it looks like to govern responsibly as we move forward in the new Trump administration. Rand Paul was great. Gerald Posner was great. Peter Schweizer is always as great. I was okay too. So we hope you enjoy this episode of The Drill Down. Happy New Year. We'll be back with new content very shortly. So here's part one with Gerald Posner.
Draining the swamp. One corrupt politician at a time. This is the Sean Hannity Show.
It's Peter Schweizer, 𝐃𝐫𝐤𝐥𝐥. We're filling in for Sean Hannity. We do the Drill Down podcast. You can subscribe to it on any podcast platform that's out there. And we are going to be talking next, I think, about a topic that's been ignored, frankly, quite a bit. I mean, I remember where I was when the Donald Trump assassination attempt took place, the first one, the one where he was wounded in the ear. And it was huge, massive news in July, and it seems to have kind of disappeared from the national conscience, but also we don't seem to be getting a lot of updates of what actually happened.
No, it's a great point. And at the time, I thought that the coverage of the Trump assassination attempt, because like you, I also remember where I was. It was massive news. But there was a lot happening because then, Joe Biden was still in the race, and then he got out of the race, and that seemed to shift it. And it felt like covering the Trump assassination, which was a largely positive story for Donald Trump, seemed like the media helping the Trump campaign. It was a positive story. So it almost like that you can't cover real news because it's good for Donald Trump. And we know firsthand how much the media is not into doing that. And so that I thought that was one reason that went away. But then when the United Healthcare shooting happened, and we instantly, within 48 hours, knew everything about the dude that did that.
Yeah.
And we still know so little about the person that took a shot at the next president of the United States. I think it puts it, to quote Kamala Harris, into a different context.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we have a great guest now to talk to about this. He's literally one of my favorite writers, Gerald Posner. He's an investigative journalist. He's written sort of the definitive books, I would argue, on a series of high-profile assassinations. He's the author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, which came out in 1993, and also Killing the Dream, James Earl Ray and the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And what's interesting thing about Gerald is we had him on our podcast after the Trump assassination attempt. And Gerald, who's very level-headed, very detailed and focused on facts, who's not a conspiracy theorist, he was kind of surprised at the ineptness in which the Secret Service and the federal authorities were investigating the Trump assassination. So we wanted to have Gerald back again to get an update. Where are we? What do we know? What don't we know? How things might be going awry. Gerald, are you there? Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I am, Peter. Eric, thanks so much for talking about this, because you're right. It's sort of like it fell off the shelf in terms of focus from the media, and there are so many other subjects that jumped ahead of it. And that, of course, is the greatest dereliction of duty I've ever seen from the Secret Service. And it's that first assassination attempt, especially so when it came so close to Trump actually being, hit by the assassin by a bullet just a fraction of an inch away from his head. And afterwards, who loves the fact that it's fallen off the radar more than the Secret Service and the federal agencies? No one, because they'd rather be talking about just about anything but. And one of the things I hope the new administration does is, in terms of oversight, is demanding the full follow-up that the American public deserves to know, not just about the things we already have out there and the mistakes that were made, but the much deeper concerns about how security was held back at times from the Trump rallies, what the politics were behind that, and the ineptitude that's not just on the local police, but on the feds in particular.
Yeah, and it seems to me, Gerald, that they're going to have to go in there. It's probably going to be kind of like trench warfare, right? It's not like the Secret Service or any government agency, for that matter, likes being embarrassed, likes to have their dirty laundry aired, but it needs to be aired. So my first question to you would be, how do you actually go about doing that? The second question, though, is, and again, I try to follow these things, but it seems to me there's kind of an information black hole about the would-be assassin himself. We don't really know that much more about his motive. Is that because he's a mystery man, or do you think that's because it's maybe being held back or might be embarrassing, or might be construed as serving some kind of political agenda?
Exactly that question we can't answer, because the information is not being put out there. What we need is the full information about him. So right now, the attempted assassin is like a Rorschach test. You can put into him whatever you want. You want to think that he was just a lone nutter who was out there to shoot Trump. You want to think that he was part of a secret agency that sent him out there to try to shoot Trump. There's all types of things you can fit in, because the government's its own worst enemy in not providing us the full information about what they know about him, the social apps that he used, the information that he had, the private security material around him. We need to see it so that we can independently draw conclusions about what motivated him. We don't always get a final answer. Not everybody leaves a manifesto. Not everybody is like the Unabomber, and gives you 40,000 words about why they did it. So I get it that people like to have it wrapped up in a neat little bow and to know exactly why somebody ended up on a roof at 23 years of age shooting at the former president, the next president of the United States. And we may not get it as neatly wrapped up, but we certainly need to see the information in the public domain and have it transparent, and that we're not getting at all.
So speaking of transparency, Gerald, and that's a word we've used a decent amount today, because, that's kind of a common theme between all the different stories that we're covering. This debate in the House and in Congress over how to fund the government. It's now actually happening in a transparent way, mostly because it's happening through social media. And we can see the stuff that they put in the first bill, the pay raises, and like all the DEI zoo and all these crazy things that can be rightly rejected because we know that they exist. We've talked about the coverage about Joe Biden, and the more we learn about the steps that his staff and the people that we pay with tax dollars took to hide what should have been another massive story in the country, which is the fact that the president of the United States is having to be told by aides when and where to exit stages that, to quote the Wall Street Journal, would have been obvious to an average person. I mean, that's who was in charge of the country. And the point is this, is that have the elites and the government gotten so used to just being, in their minds, allowed to lie to the American people that this is another thing that they just don't feel like we deserve to know? And is that unusual? I mean, you have looked into the JFK assassination. You've studied American history. Where would you put what the government feels like we should and deserve to know in a historical context? Because it seems like it might be at an all-time low.
Yeah, it might be at an all-time low, Eric, but I think that the government has always had this elite view, which is we're going to give the people as little as possible. We're going to give them just what we need to give them to get to do what we want to do. It's just that it's more visible now because, like you said, we can go on X and we can see called out almost in real time the list of items in the 1,500 pages of the original bill that's just pure pork. In the old days, you would have had to wait a few days for a newspaper article, 30 years ago, to do a story about what was pork. They would have picked up 1/10 of it after the bill was already passed. So I think the elites got used to figuring out they didn't have to say much. And the story, by the way, in the Wall Street Journal about how Biden's aides and the officials in government had to isolate him, cut out negative news, sort of handle him in a way to hide the cognitive decline that he had from really almost right in office. That story is pretty infuriating on its own, but what really makes seem kind of out of my head is the idea that they were not just trying to wrap up a 4-year presidency and say, hey, we got away with it. They were trying to get another 4 years out of it. They intended to run the government themselves. They just needed the figurehead, Biden, to be able to do well enough in the election to beat Trump. And then, of course, it all fell apart in that first debate. But if it had not, when I was reading that article in the Journal, I kept thinking to myself, they weren't just lying to us and holding back the facts and saying, let's run out the clock, it's over in November. They were saying, let's get another 4 out of it. And that, to me, you talk about threat to democracy, the thing that was used all the time by the left, Trump's going to be a threat to democracy. Forget about that. You lost your democracy under the Biden administration, would have lost it for another 4 because a secret cabal of aides and officials that held different degrees of power who were never elected to any office at all were running the presidency with a figurehead up there.
And by the way, that's not conspiracy. That's like a real thing that we all sort of just now no, that's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We're talking with Gerald Posner, who is really a premier investigative journalist, really one of my favorite writers. He's written a number of books that you ought to look into. And we're talking to him about the Trump assassination and about government sort of hiding information and secrets. I have 2 questions for you, Gerald. The first one on the Trump assassination, the sort of black hole of information. And this may be a speculative question. I understand that. But do you believe that the withholding of information is incompetence, or is it actually by design? And my second question is on a totally different subject, but it's related. I want you to comment. I want to get your thoughts on the drones, because it seems to me the same thing is going on with the drones, where there's this lack of information. They seem to lie to us to say, oh, there's nothing to see here. People don't believe it. So it leads to all kinds of speculative attitudes. Could you comment also on the drones? But first, give us your thoughts on the assassination attempt, the lack of information, and what you think the motivation is or what's going on there.
Yeah, so I think that they tie in an odd way. I mean, that may seem strange when I first say that the lack of information on the assassination and the drones tie in, but meaning the way the government responds. They pass off, it's intentional almost all the time. When they're withholding information, it is with malice of forethought. As we used to say as a lawyer, I'm not a practicing lawyer any longer. I don't practice, but that's what we used to call it when you had intent. They have intent to withhold it. They know exactly what they're doing, but they want to cover it under the umbrella of incompetence, so that people think, oh, yeah, maybe the drones really belong to them. Maybe they just, didn't have somebody looking at the roof at the site. They were spread too thin, and they just haven't gotten around to it. The right part of the bureaucracy hasn't yet released the information, and so therefore you think that's government, bungling and inefficient, which it often is, but the inefficient part of it gets to cover the more nefarious parts of withholding information and keeping people from getting to the truth.
No, it's a great point. We're talking with Gerald Posner. And I guess final question for me, Gerald, talking about transparency, it does seem to be a sea change. And one reason why clearly is because of the role that social media, and I think Twitter or X specifically, seems to be playing in it. You commented on Twitter recently that Rand Paul gets the award for the most out-of-the-box suggestion when I think he suggested that the Speaker of the House could be Elon Musk. Is that something not that Elon Musk would be Speaker of the House, but it's an interesting time. If you've studied previously a lack of information, the way the government controls information, it's kind of amazing the era that we live in now where you can actually see through this lens the mechanisms of government at work in real time.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely, it's a sea change for those of us who have been investigative journalists and covered the government in years past. Now you have the major public square social media platform in terms of Twitter for news. Every organization is on there, heads of state, all the political groups, every police organization, and now you have the person who owns Twitter essentially as a confidant and close to and having played a key role in the re-election of President Trump, having a voice in this administration, running Doge, and having a say. And so you see he pushes a lever and people respond, and there are a lot of people doing it on there. The Rand Paul suggestion was, I thought, when I saw it, and I know there had been talk a year or two ago about Trump possibly being the Speaker of the House, right, if he took a seat in Florida. But the idea of, somebody coming in as Speaker of the House who wasn't a member of the House is pretty extraordinary. We all forget that that's possible. The idea that it could be Elon Musk must have set people's hair on fire on MSNBC and other platforms, just at the very 1 in 10,000 possibility. So I do love to see those things play out. But there's real news there. You see developments take place, and it's much harder, I love this, for politicians and public officials to hide the truth for a very long time because they keep getting hammered in the public square, and eventually they have to either go silent, cancel their account, or they have to come up with the goods.
We've been talking to Gerald Posner, who's one of my favorite investigative journalists. He's the author of Case Closed. He's the author of Dream, which is about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Also has a newer book out called Pharma, about pharma. I would encourage anybody that's looking for a great read as a Christmas gift, pick up a book by Gerald Posner. Gerald, thanks for joining us, and we hope that the transparency revolution is going to continue because this seems to be a good time for transparency.
Yeah, I mean, it's overdue. We're not going to get everything we want. We're not going to learn all the secrets at once. I guarantee you that. But we're certainly going to push in a disruptive way, and disruptive being good in this sense, because the old way of doing it, which is just to sort of keep the public at a distance and tell them only what they need to know actually everything the government is doing. It's because the only way that people can eventually determine who they want to put into political office, the people who are really serving public good and those who are just serving their own good.
Well, the Gerald Posner, we're going to do our best to continue to try to tell you, the American people, as much as we know about what your government's doing. We'll continue doing that right after this. He's Peter Schweizer. I'm Eric Eggers. This is the Sean Hannity Radio Show. So that was Gerald Posner. Now for part two, as promised, here is our first ever interview on the Drill Down podcast with a sitting member of the United States Senate, Senator Rand Paul.
Listen to this show one time and you're Hannitized. Sean Hannity is back on the radio.
Welcome back to the Sean Hannity Radio Show. My name is Eric Eggers. I'm joined by author Peter Schweizer. We co-host a podcast called The Drill Down with Peter Schweizer. We're talking about lots of different stories, the things that are happening right now, and we're very excited right now to be joined by U.S. Senator Rand Paul, who just came from, I think, giving a speech on the Senate floor. Senator Paul, can you give us the latest in this ongoing discussion over whether or not and how we should continue to fund the United States government?
Well, I was proud of conservatives yesterday who stood up in the House and said that an unlimited debt ceiling where you can spend as much as you want with no dollar limit for 2 years, that's just not fiscally conservative. So most of these guys and men and women were in the Freedom Caucus, but they stood up, they were fiscally conservative and said, we won't vote for that. So they voted down the unlimited debt ceiling idea. But today there's still another vote going on, and it'll be coming over to the Senate soon, and it'll be a continuing resolution. That means we will continue to spend money at the same rate as we have been all year. But that same rate has led to a $2 trillion deficit this last year. So I think continuing spending at the same rate without reducing spending is a terrible idea, but it's worse than that. They added $100 billion that they will borrow for disaster. They added another $30 billion they're going to borrow for farmer subsidies. And then they also, this week in the Senate, voted for an expansion of Social Security by $200 billion, even though Social Security is on its way to bankruptcy and actually currently spends more than it takes in. So It isn't a good week to be for fiscal conservatism. Yes, conservatives are standing up and fighting, but we're losing. The swamp is winning. The big government Republicans are spending and borrowing more money, and the Democrats are happily going along with all of it.
Well, that's the thing, Senator Paul, that I've always appreciated about you, which is what you say is what you vote. And the problem is there are a lot of people in the Republican Party who talk like they are fiscal conservatives, but they don't actually end up doing that. Is this going to get easier when we have a Republican House and a Republican Senate and Donald Trump is the presidency? Or are we going to have this continued problem with Republicans failing to actually live up to what they promised the American people they would do?
You know, in many ways, we've met the enemy, and it's us. I mean, it's within the Republican Party. The Democrats are of no value. They will not lie to you, though. They don't care about the debt. They believe in this modern monetary theory that you can just print money at the Fed forever and buy whatever you want. Republicans go home to the Rotary and the Chamber of Commerce and Lions Club, and they tell you how they hate big government and they want to balance the budget, and they vote for all the spendings. So it's about split. This week we had a vote on expanding Social Security. But Social Security this year lost $40 billion. So, you know, all the payroll taxes we pay, and we pay a ton of payroll taxes, we spent $40 billion more giving Social Security benefits than we brought in taxes. So what we did is this bill, not me, I voted against it, but about half of the Republicans, I think 24 of us voted against, no, 25 of us actually voted against this, and 24 voted for it. But by expanding Social Security by $200 billion, that means the deficit this year, instead of being $40 billion, will be $60. So they've increased the Social Security deficit by 50%, and it's running out of money and will be out of money by 2033. So it's a perpetual fight, and it really is. People need to identify, and in Republican states, they need to say, you know, is my senator, is my congressman conservative, or is he really part of the swamp?
You mentioned that it's not been a good week to be a fiscal conservative, and I say this sort of tongue-in-cheek, but sort of seriously. Is it ever a good week to be a fiscal conservative? I mean, Mitt Romney ran on this platform to bring back fiscal restraint in 2012, and he lost soundly, and it doesn't seem like we've kind of taken that issue seriously since then. Is this something that you think we have given up on as a country, or actually do you feel like the fact that just in the last week people started to point out some of the ridiculous spending measures that were in that original bill, that 1,547-page bill, and they highlighted how bad that was? Did that give you any hope at all?
Well, you know, Vivek and Elon have brought a lot of attention to government waste. I've been talking about it for a decade. And it's easy to find the waste, but they're drawing good attention to it. But the battle's just getting started, so we have to get rid of it. And I'll give you another example. So a lot of the science waste, so-called science, let's say $1 million spent studying Japanese quail to see if you give them cocaine, are they more sexually promiscuous on cocaine? That usually draws laughter because people say that's ridiculous. You had to make that up. Now, it was $1 million. It came from the National Science Foundation. Well, about a year ago, big government Republicans passed a bill called the CHIPS Act, which subsidizes big chip manufacturers like Intel. So Intel's probably nearly $1 trillion company, and it's getting government subsidies, but it also doubled the size of the National Science Foundation that has studies on the Panamanian frog to see if the country frogs have a mating call than the city frogs. I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, it's just insane that $1.5 million spent on, if you take a selfie of yourself while smiling and then look at it later in the day, will that make you happy? My favorite one is from a while back where they wanted to find out what makes you more aggressive, tequila or gin. And we all know the answer. Come on. But they had an experiment, and they fed codfish gin, and they fed the other half of the codfish tequila. Now, I don't even know how you get a codfish to drink tequila. They did it half.
Very carefully.
And you are right, tequila. Tequila makes more aggressive and people too. But, you know, it's just that insanity. But then Republicans go along with doubling the size of that. That's the downside. You want to hear the plus side? We do agree on lower taxes. We agree on less regulation. Most of us appreciate the power of capitalism and appreciate the wealth and prosperity that is dragging everybody up. I mean, the statistics are amazing how even despite the inflation of the last 3 or 4 years, the overall historical trend is that the middle class is moving up. and moving up even into the upper class. So there is good news about capitalism that we need to talk about. But there's some, we have to keep our eyes open and not take our eye off the ball as far as the spending goes.
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. We want to play a clip for you. We had Nancy Mace on earlier, and this is what she was told by the leadership in the House as far as what the Senate could or couldn't do involving the spending legislation that's coming forward. Just listen to Nancy Mace and give us your thoughts whether this is true or not true.
I sat in two meetings today with groups of Republicans where the lie was stated that if we do single subject bills tonight, do a clean CR, do a separate disaster relief bill and a separate farm extension or farm type bill, that the Senate could only take up one bill. That is a lie. There is nothing limiting the Senate from taking up three bills. We also, as a House, could do three separate single subject bills and then do what's called a MIRV, M-E-R-V. And what the MIRV would do is we would do this three separate votes and then combine the bills together as they were sent over to the Senate so they only have one vote. So, there are many options and vehicles and ways that we can go about this. But again, Republicans were lied to. Because they were lied to, they got scared. And so it sounds like we're going to do the CR again, the CR that we did last night, but no debt ceiling. So it's just the same thing, a different year.
So, Senator Paul, is that true? The Senate can only handle one bill at a time?
The rules in the Senate are arcane, Byzantine, and hard to understand. But without consent, and I'm one of the ones who is flying the ointment often, if I don't consent to let them bring up three bills tonight, they can't. Because it takes a while. You got to go through several votes, procedural votes. It slows things down. And that can be good if you're preventing bad stuff, and most of the stuff they're passing is bad. But there's a chance I will give them consent tonight, and the leverage I have of blocking these bills is that I have two amendments that they'll defeat me on, but I will bring forward. The American people will know that we care, some of us. I will put forward something called the Government Shutdown Prevention Act, and if I get a vote on that, may let them bring all the bills up tonight, even though I will vote against the bills. The Government Shutdown Prevention Act says when there's not an agreement, when there's an impasse and government's going to shut down, it doesn't shut down. It just continues funding, but with 6% less funding. And that's a pretty significant cut and would probably draw people back to the negotiating table because they don't like the idea of cutting. For me, it would be great because we're at impasse all the time, and I think cutting 6% would be a good idea, which is consistent with my penny plan, which would balance the budget in 5 years. I have another bill that says for this $200 billion expansion of Social Security that you could pay for it by gradually raising the age of eligibility 3 months per year for 12 years. So by the time you get to 2036, it would be it would go from 67 to 70, and people are like, oh, you don't like old people, do you? And it's like, no, I aspire to be an old person. I want to save it for when I am there. I want to save it for all the rest of the next generation, and you can't save it if you don't fix it. And you can't just keep adding expenses. So this will be the first time, if we get this vote tonight on raising the age, that this will have been offered maybe ever on the Senate floor, maybe since 1983. In 83, I think they did it through legislation, so it must have come up in 83. This may be the first time we voted on it since 83, and I will lose, but it'll presage or give forenotice to the people what's coming, and that this vote will have to happen again. Eventually, will have to be done.
Well, this is one of the things I appreciate about you, Senator Paul. You really come up with some amazing policy ideas. So instead of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, you come up with some amazing reform ideas. I know you're a supporter of the idea of single subject bills, so you don't get these monstrous trains that kind of go through the legislative process where they add a lot of pork. Another great idea that I don't know if you actually introduced legislation, but you talked about the fact of having transparency. If an amendment is offered to a bill, actually have some explanation of who actually wrote the bill. Was that a lobbyist? Who was it that actually wrote that legislation? And that, to me, seems to be the path we have to go forward to in a Trump term where you have the House and Senate, actual structural reform. Because if we keep doing the same thing, the Democrats at some point are probably going to come to power again, and we're going to keep having these same problems over and over again. How optimistic are you with the new administration, with the new House and Senate, that we're actually going to get changes to the manner in which we do things, not just the cuts, which of course are important as well.
Well, I think you bring out a good point as far as that the process makes a difference in what ultimately the result is. For example, our founders intended that there in history suggests that there would be individual appropriation bills. There's 12 different departments of government. There's 12 different spending bills. If you pass 11 of them, and then the 12th one is the Treasury, and you say, I don't want 80,000 new IRS agents, we control the House of Representatives, why wouldn't they pass 10 or 11 of these? That way, 10/12 of government is still open, and say to the Department of Treasury, you can rot in hell if you don't get rid of these IRS agents. Our people are for this, and we're going to fund you at 80% of the level. We're going to retrench all that money for IRS agents, and we're not going to do it. Pick some one item you're going to win on. Instead, that never happens. We never win. We never exert the power of the purse, because what happens is the Republicans will put something forward, and the Democrats will say, we don't like that. And then the Democrats say, you shut down the government. And the Republicans say, oh, we're afraid to do that. But the thing is, you don't have this big sort of cataclysmic shutdown of government if you can pass some of the spending bills, get them off the table. So what you're discussing is 1/12 of the government coming to a halt for a while we force a compromise. But the way I perceive what happens is even when we take over the House, like right now we have the House, what percentage of the power of the purse are we using? 0. Not 10%. We're not getting 50% of what we want. So the bill they put forward, this continuing resolution, $100 billion for disasters, $30 billion for farmers, another $200 billion for Social Security, that's not a compromise. They've already sold themselves out before we even get to the Senate. So it's not like they're waiting and the Senate wants something worse. They've already produced something so bad, so big in spending, and so much debt that the Senate's going to pick it up and it'll pass it tonight also. Not me. The Democrats and the big government Republicans will.
It's really fun to hear you, Senator Paul, because you're just coming off the Senate floor. You're talking to the American people. You're telling them what votes are going to happen. You're saying we're going to lose, but here's why we're doing it. I think, to be honest, this is exactly the kind of transparency and invitation to the American public into the process that I do think our founding fathers wanted, and our country is better because of it. So thank you for taking the time to join us and giving people some insight into the process, not just today, but moving forward. Thank you very much for the time today, sir.
Thanks, guys.
Rand Paul for the win, right, everybody? I don't know about you, but I was a huge fan of his father, Dr. Ron Paul, and so it was really fun for us to talk to Rand Paul, and it's kind of cool to see how he still, I think, carries on that interesting ideological independent streak that his father became so popular for. We appreciate your ideological independence in deciding to choose us each and every time we come up with an episode. It means a lot for us that you've been part of the Drill Down family for this year. We've seen so much growth and improvement in terms of our ratings. If you like this episode, if you like any episodes, feel free to leave us a 5-star review or whatever you think is appropriate. Maybe a comment if you like. It just helps us with the algorithms. We know those algorithms are very important these days. But most importantly, just thank you for listening and choosing to find our content wherever podcasts are found and also at thedrilldown.com. Thanks a lot.